Radioactivity, discovered in 1896, has revolutionized our understanding of food safety, transforming it from an unknown phenomenon to a powerful tool in modern food science. Today, scientists harness radiation's dual nature, using techniques like food irradiation to eliminate harmful microorganisms and extend shelf life while dealing with radioactive food and water contamination risks. Radioactivity's omnipresence in our environment extends from the Earth's crust to the atmosphere. We receive some radiation from natural sources like radon gas from the ground, cosmic rays from the sun, and even trace amounts in foods such as nuts and bananas. While we cannot eliminate these natural sources, we face additional unnatural radiation exposure from contaminated water and food. "80 years ago, our food and water supplies were essentially free from radioactive contamination, as humanity had not yet unleashed the power of the atom through nuclear weapons mining or power generation. This era of relative radiological purity in our environment came to an abrupt end on July 16, 1945, when the United States detonated the world's first nuclear weapon in the New Mexican desert as part of the Trinity test. This pivotal moment marked the beginning of widespread radioactive contamination of our food and water resources. The explosion dispersed radioactive fallout over 1,100 square miles, with some debris reaching as far north as Canada. Hundreds of more nuclear tests conducted between 1945 and 1962 in New Mexico and Nevada further exacerbated this contamination, affecting 46 of the 48 contiguous United States, as well as parts of Canada and Mexico. The spread of radioactive materials from these tests in contaminated soil and water sources has entered the food chain through vegetation and livestock. The nuclear arms race, initiated by the United States in 1945, quickly engulfed other world powers, leading to widespread global radioactive contamination. Russia, China, England, and France joined the race, conducting their nuclear tests and contributing to the spread of radioactive materials. These nations detonate hundreds of atomic bombs in various locations, from remote deserts to Pacific atolls, dispersing radioactive fallout across the world. The contamination knows no borders, affecting all food chains, all water sources, and all ecosystems worldwide. Atmospheric and underground tests by these countries release radioactive particles that enter the global environment, impacting lands far from the test sites. This international nuclear activity fundamentally altered our planet, leaving a lasting legacy of contamination in our food and water resources. The legacy of nuclear bomb testing continues to impact our food and water supplies, with contamination persisting in various regions. In the United States, areas downwind of the Nevada test site, including parts of Utah, Nevada, and Arizona, still show high levels of radioactive elements in soil and groundwater. This contamination affects local agriculture, with crops grown in this area absorbing radionuclides like strontium-90 and cesium-137. Milk from cows grazing on contaminated pastures in these regions contains higher levels of radioactive iodine-131, posing a particular risk to children's thyroid health. Globally, the effects of nuclear testing on food and water supplies extend far beyond test sites. In Kazakhstan, the area surrounding the former Semipalatinsk test site continues to have elevated levels of radioactivity in soil and water sources. Local produce and livestock from this region contained higher concentrations of radionuclides, which increase cancer. Similarly, in the Pacific, former test sites like the Marshall Islands still deal with contaminated soil and water, irradiating local fisheries and agriculture. Consumption of contaminated foods from these areas leads to increased various cancers, including thyroid, leukemia, and bone cancer, as well as potential developmental issues in children. Uranium mining and processing have left extensive radioactive contamination in numerous areas across the United States, affecting food and water supplies. In the Navajo Nation, which spans parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, abandoned uranium mines have contaminated water sources since the 1950s. The contamination has seeped into groundwater and surface water, affecting drinking water and agricultural irrigation. In Sanders, Arizona, a predominantly Navajo community has been exposed to uranium levels in tap water exceeding twice the legal limit. The Puerco River Basin in New Mexico and Arizona has also been impacted with radioactive water and sediment released from uranium mining activities contaminating water used by residents and livestock. In the western United States, over 160,000 abandoned hard rock mines have created chronic exposure conditions for Native American communities. These mines have contaminated soil and water with metal mixtures, including radioactive elements. The Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, home to the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribes, faces health concerns due to a former uranium mill and its remediated waste pile. In New Mexico, the Homestake Mining Company's uranium mill contaminated groundwater with uranium and selenium, affecting nearby communities for decades. The pollution spread to farmlands through irrigation, contaminating topsoil with elevated levels of radioactive materials. These examples represent only a fraction of the mining areas that have impacted food and water supplies, with countless other sites worldwide. Radioactive contamination from uranium mining and nuclear activities is a global issue affecting the people and ecosystems worldwide. In South Africa's Witwatersrand Basin, inadequate controls in the uranium mining industry have led to widespread contamination. The region's water sources, including the Wanderfontein-Spruit, show alarmingly high levels of radioactivity, with uranium concentrations in sediments reaching up to 10,000 becquerels per kilogram, 5 times the proposed maximum limit. This contaminated water is used for irrigation, accumulating radioactive elements in crops and livestock. Residents in areas such as Carltonville, Weston Area, and Kutsong unknowingly consume contaminated food and water daily, facing increased health risks. In Central Asia, the Kyrgyz Republic deals with a legacy of 70 radioactive waste sites, including 36 uranium tailing sites. The Meilusu site, located 30 kilometers from Uzbekistan, poses significant environmental and health risks to the densely populated Fergana Valley. Local communities rely on contaminated water sources for drinking and agriculture, resulting in the constant ingestion of radioactive materials through their food and water. In Brazil, the Interlagos mill site, which processes radioactive monazite, is now affecting local food markets and water supplies. Canada faces its problems with uranium ore contamination at a railhead in its northern regions, impacting indigenous communities who depend on local water sources and traditional foods. These examples represent only a fraction of the contaminated sites worldwide. Countless other locations, from abandoned mines in the western United States to former nuclear facilities in Europe and Asia, continue to cause havoc on human health and the environment. In most of these areas, people unknowingly consume contaminated food and water daily, as radioactive substances continue to enter the food chain through contaminated soil and water used in agriculture and livestock farming. Nuclear power plant incidents, from minor releases to catastrophic meltdowns, augment the global food and water radioactive contamination crisis. Thousands of leaks and releases, often unreported, continuously add to the environmental burden. Each incident contaminates soil and water, creating a domino effect that impacts drinking water, produce, and livestock. Full-scale meltdowns, like those we've witnessed and will likely see again, unleash unprecedented levels of radioactive material into the environment. These events devastate ecosystems, rendering vast areas uninhabitable and contaminating food and water for generations. The Fukushima meltdown exemplifies the far-reaching consequences of nuclear disasters. Japan dumped over 10 million radioactive one-ton cleanup bags at thousands of sites, many now leaking, while thyroid cancer rates soar. For a decade, 55 countries banned Japanese food imports, shifting the burden of contaminated produce to nations like the USA and Canada. This crisis highlights a pervasive issue: the proximity of nuclear facilities to agricultural areas, increasing the risk of widespread food contamination. The health impact is enormous, with Canada's healthcare system buckling under the strain. Patients now face up to 6-month waits for doctor appointments or CAT scans, a situation linked to long-term exposure to low-level radiation through food and water. The global contamination of oceans and waterways with radioactive waste is a widespread and ongoing issue involving numerous nations. The United States has dumped tens of thousands of 55-gallon radioactive drums into the oceans, while Russia burns radioactive forests and sinks nuclear submarines. Other countries continue to dump waste into rivers, oceans, and aquifers. This contamination enters the marine food chain, accumulating in fish and seafood consumed worldwide. As people eat contaminated seafood, radioactive particles build up in their bodies over time. Japan's current release of radioactive water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean is causing immediate ecological impacts. This discharge affects marine life, harming starfish, sea urchins, and West Coast tide pools. It's also linked to fish, bird, and animal die-offs along affected coastlines. The contamination spreads through ocean currents, affecting fish stocks and seafood far beyond Japan's shores. Consumers unknowingly ingest these contaminated fish and shellfish, gradually accumulating radioactive materials. The consequences of this global radioactive pollution are far-reaching. Radionuclides enter the marine food chain through phytoplankton and bioaccumulate up to larger organisms. This process concentrates radioactive materials in the fish and seafood that reach our plates. Simultaneously, contaminated water sources used for irrigation introduce these radioactive elements into crops and livestock. As a result, people consume contaminated food and water daily, and their radioactive burden increases over time. This accumulation poses long-term health risks, potentially contributing to increased cancer rates and other radiation-related illnesses in affected populations. The regulation of radiation exposure limits has evolved significantly over the past century, with different countries and international organizations adopting varying approaches. In the United States, the occupational exposure limit was set at 5 rem per year in 1967, 27 years before the federal adoption of this standard. The Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program has strictly adhered to this limit, with no personnel exceeding 40% of the annual limit since 1980. Europe generally adopts more stringent standards than the United States. The European Union's approach allows member states to set limits, resulting in a diverse regulatory landscape. Some countries, like Belgium and Italy, have implemented stricter limits based on the precautionary principle or public pressure. For instance, Belgium limits exposure in residential areas to 20 to 40% of the EU recommendation, while Italy sets limits as low as 2% for specific frequencies. The average annual radiation exposure for Europeans is estimated to be 4 to 4 millisieverts, with sources like radon contributing significantly. Medical procedures account for the largest man-made source of exposure in Europe. In contrast, the United States shows more significant variation in natural background radiation, ranging from 131.5 millirem per year in Florida to 962.9 millirem per year in South Dakota. As global contamination from nuclear activities increases, there's a concerning trend of governments raising exposure limits rather than addressing root causes. Radiation monitoring in imported food is alarmingly inconsistent. While countries set limits for radionuclides, enforcement varies widely. U.S. Customs uses radiation detection equipment, but not all ports have equal capabilities. Testing methods require expensive equipment and specialized training, making comprehensive screening difficult. The FDA's approach has changed over time, recently relaxing measures for Japanese radioactive imports. This inconsistency in testing procedures leaves consumers in the dark about radiation levels in their food and water. The extent of radioactive contamination in our food supply remains uncertain. The global spread of radioactive contamination is relentless, with spent nuclear fuel rods, decommissioned power plants, accidents, and military applications all contributing to this pervasive issue. This radioactive snowfall accumulates and infiltrates our environment, affecting worldwide soil, water, and food supplies. Spent fuel rods and decommissioning waste create long-term storage problems, while depleted uranium munitions contaminate conflict zones. These sources introduce increasingly radioactive materials into our ecosystems, persisting for thousands of years. As this contamination accumulates, it inevitably enters our food chain and water supplies. Crops absorb radioactive particles from contaminated soil, while livestock consume these crops and drink from tainted water sources. Seafood becomes more contaminated as radionuclides make their way into rivers and oceans, This cycle ensures a constant influx of radioactive materials into our diet. We unknowingly consume these contaminated foods and water daily, leading to a gradual buildup of radioactive substances in our bodies. If this trend continues unchecked, we risk approaching a critical threshold, a radiation overdose on a global scale. The nuclear industry's tight control over radiation information in our food supply is alarming. Despite official claims of low natural levels, the reality may be far more concerning. Generic responses about trace amounts of potassium-40 or carbon-14 in bananas, Brazil nuts, radiation from the sun, or flying in jets mask a potentially darker truth. As man-made, accidental, or discarded radiation accumulates in our environment, like unmelting snow, the contamination in our food and water remains obscured. Data suppression and difficulty accessing accurate information should raise red flags for the planet. To uncover the truth, individuals must take matters into their own hands. While still legal and available, purchasing personal radiation detection equipment could become necessary for testing everyday items like salmon, rice, and bottled water at the supermarket. As regulations tighten, these tools may become more challenging to obtain. The ongoing buildup of radioactive elements in our food chain resembles an intensifying addiction. Without transparency and accurate data, we risk unknowingly consuming increasingly potent doses of radiation, approaching a critical threshold for public health. It will not be long before we wear radiation detection dosimeters to monitor our daily exposures. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for future Clevelandmarko videos. This video material comes from a chapter in Marko's book, Nuclear Extinction Event is Killing Our Families, which can be found in Marko Vovk's Amazon books. The links for this book are also provided below.